You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I'm Sherry Lip, the marketing manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Nathan Whittacre, the CEO of Stimulus Technologies. And today we are going to be talking about board-proofing your cybersecurity for nonprofits. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to the podcast today.
This is an interesting topic because probably a lot of people don't think about it if they're not in the nonprofit world. But what considerations do nonprofits need to take when you're dealing with a board?
Well, a couple of things. A lot of board members of nonprofits are volunteer, but they have a certain amount of liability by being on the board of the nonprofit. I'll just use an example. When I formed a flying club with a few partners about 11 years ago, we set it up as a nonprofit. We were unpaid board members on that, and the club increased to having about 200 flying pilot members with dozen airplanes. And one of the things that came up is, our individual risk of being on the board, having operational control of this entity, and, what liabilities did we have as board members for those operations? And certainly there's, insurance you can buy, directors and operators, board insurance that can protect the board members. But I think the board wants to know, are the operations of, the nonprofit safe? Are they doing things that are protecting donor funds, protecting the ongoing operations? And in the end, protecting their investment of time in that entity so that, a poor move on, an employee or volunteer or somebody in the organization can't cause either the nonprofit harm or them as a board harm individually. So there's a liability question, and that's probably why some people don't want to sit on boards, don't want to offer their time, because they might be high net worth individuals that have assets that could be encumbered in a potential lawsuit against the nonprofit for those operations. So there's questions about that, and how is the nonprofit protecting the board to ensure that they're protected from any claims on the entity.
So, we talk about protecting businesses and client information, but with a nonprofit, we might be talking about people who are funding them. So, what do funders want to know is in place?
Yeah, so people are writing potentially big checks to the nonprofit. I think one of the things that all people that donate to a nonprofit is wanting to ensure that those funds are being used for the purpose of that nonprofit. So are the funds in the end going to serve the the organization and the people that are that they're trying to support in the community? So if you're writing a check to fund a no-kill animal shelter, in the end, you care about the animals being protected, and so you want your funds going to that. The last thing I think donor wants is their funds going to a hacker or to illegal activity or to protecting the organization against claims, lawsuits and things like that. So, I think donors want their money to be used for the positive community purpose that they're investing in.
So, Stimulus works with some nonprofits. What are we doing? What are we putting in front of a board to ensure that kind of security, or what are we helping the nonprofit put in front of a board?
Yeah, so I think it's very similar to what most businesses need to do. They want to make sure that, from a cybersecurity standpoint, that the data is protected. Um, they want the financial controls in place to ensure that the money that's inside the organization is protected and being used for proper use. And I think the what boards are looking for, and even the people that are operating inside the company, is that there's an assurance that the systems and the mechanisms that are in place from a technology standpoint are, again, going towards serving the the people that the company or the nonprofit is set up to serve. So whether, like I said, use the animal shelter or if it's, a community support organization, whatever it may be, we have to show from a technology perspective that, they're entrusting their money and their time with an organization that's working well. And I think on top of that too is, it needs to be run like a business, that a lot of nonprofits start up, maybe one or two people, just kind of like my flying club example. A few of us had an idea of setting up this club and, wanted to serve the community, and the members, that are pilots and future pilots. And, that's the goal. And so it should be kind of seamless, but an operation standpoint, and it should be run like a business, rather than, somebody's laptop with all the information that could be unsecure, with donor information and with, client information. Some of the nonprofits that we work with have a lot of confidentiality that they have to be concerned about because they're, supporting individuals that may be targeted by, how should I put this without releasing too much, but they might be targeted in some way that, we certainly want to keep their clients protected also. So we have to put a lot in place, same things that we do elsewhere. Making sure multi-factor authentication is enabled. There's patching on all the systems. We have an EDR and MDR in place. We could generate reports to show this is the effectiveness of all the services that we have in place. We have good backups, just in case, systems are compromised or go down. And we have to do it on a budget. A lot of nonprofits are very concerned about their budget. They're working either off of grants or donor money or a combination of both, and it can't be overly expensive or onerous. So when we work with nonprofits, we try to tailor the services around affordability to ensure that, we're providing top level service, but around a commitment to ensure that those funds are, used wisely.
So, what kind of cybersecurity? How do nonprofits protect the? There's donor information, but there's also people like you mentioned. They might be, at risk or mental health issues or something like that. How does that fall under HIPAA? How is that protected?
Yeah, it depends on the organization. If there's, healthcare, if it's like a hospice or, some other type of direct healthcare, the HIPAA would apply in those cases. There they might be grant obligations if they're taking federal or state grant money. There may be compliance obligations under those grants that they have to ensure that they're complying with. The regulatory environment around this is just as strict in many cases as, again, a for-profit institution, whether, like you mentioned, HIPAA, but there may be more strings attached because of the federal grants or the state grants that they're receiving have a significant amount of compulsory regulatory requirements.
And do we help nonprofits go over, what compliance they are obligated to be under or, to fulfill? And how do they know? Do we help them find out what they need?
Well, we would certainly want to work with their attorneys that have reviewed the contracts. We aren't a law firm, a legal firm. So the first thing is, their outside counsel or internal counsel would be, very well aware of their obligations. So our goal would be to coordinate with their attorneys, to ensure that their grant requirements or those compliance requirements are being met by the services that we're providing. And it's pretty straightforward. I would think that, again, the same type of frameworks that we would put in place for a for-profit business, whether it's, like NIST 2.0 or, HIPAA compliance or things like that. Much of the compliance requirements, fall under very similar frameworks. So we would look at, implementing some type of framework like NIST to ensure that they're meeting those compliance requirements.
And are nonprofits the target of the same types of cyber attacks as regular businesses?
Oh, for sure.
Unfortunately.
Again, a lot of times, if a hacker really wants to get after some of these funds, they would be a lot of the grant funds when they're coming in are publicly announced. So they might, monitor for announcements, public announcements in the news, maybe press releases of when funds come in, and they may be just laying in wait to see for that $1 million check or whatever from the federal government coming into their organization, and then they'll make the move at that point. So, um, a hacker, a cyber criminal that is willing to take the time to go after these organizations will strike when the money's available. So, and unfortunately, we tell them when it is because we say, hey, we received these grant funds. This is a perfect time to come steal from me. So, definitely have to be on the lookout for and around those areas. When the funds are coming.
Have you found any unique challenges into cybersecurity or implementing things like MFA or offboarding employees with nonprofits that's different than in regular business?
I think one of the biggest challenges is there's a lot of volunteers in nonprofit organizations and they come and go. So it's, kind of part-time or seasonal volunteering or, maybe a few hours a week. And there may be more resistance to some of the security controls by volunteers, but they may have access to the same, donor database or client database. And, the same security controls need to be put in place. So, the whole thought about like bring your own device, let a volunteer use their own laptop to get access to your client database or maybe donor database or whatever you have inside your organization. That's a scary prospect. So that's probably the biggest one that we get concerned about is volunteers and keeping the organization safe from somebody that might have access to data inside the organization but they don't want to follow the same protocols. They haven't gone through the same security training. They don't have the same MFA setup or things like that. So I that's probably the biggest concern. Businesses obviously may have an intern come in but they treat them as an employee and there's a specific contract for that internship. Whereas volunteers can come and go. You might have a volunteer that's, working, 4 hours for this week or whatever it may be, and but they need access to things. So ensuring that you're following the protocols of the organization, whether it's a full-time employee, part-time employee, or a volunteer, I think is essential. And that's kind of a unique thing for nonprofits.
And nonprofits might be under a very tight budget. How do we work with them to ensure that they're getting everything they need within their budget?
So, we look at, yeah, from a Stimulus Technologies, we do offer nonprofit discounts. So I'll throw that out there. My sales team might be mad at me for saying that publicly on a podcast, but we do offer some discounts to nonprofits. We like supporting the community that we're in. We also look at, what are their needs, and it's user based pricing. So, we depending on the size of the organization, it's pretty easy to budget in like giving a cell phone to an employee. It's not terribly expensive. And, as you scale up or scale down, depending on, and that's what happens a lot with nonprofits is they might have a big project, they might get a big grant fund that they need to bring on team members to do that work. We can scale up temporarily and then scale back down as maybe the grant funding changes or there's different needs. So that's the scalability change of the organization, which is different than hiring like a full-time IT person internally. If you hire somebody that's like a permanent employee taking care of your IT needs, you always have that salary. Whereas working with a managed service provider, they can scale depending on the needs of the organization. So, uh, that's we work with the nonprofits. Often sometimes they will come to us and say, we have, you know, we're waiting for this grant funding to come in. It's been awarded, but it hasn't been given. Work with us for a little bit, and we're definitely more than capable of helping nonprofits work through their budgetary constraints as they come into.
All right, and last question for a nonprofit that's looking for an IT support, what should they look for to help fit their what they need?
I think experience working with nonprofits is a first start. If that's a target area that the MSP works for, because there are nuances to working with nonprofits. I think the capability of providing that cybersecurity and the compliance frameworks are really essential. when they're working for it. So if your board member's nephew does IT support and looking for help, that's probably not the best way to go unless they have a really good organization behind them. So you want a company that understands the nuances of working with nonprofits, has the capability, capacity to help the nonprofit in the space they're in, and very similar to what advice I'd give a regular business, but it's definitely that those nuances are different with nonprofits to find the right partner to do the work.
All right. Well, thanks, Nathan. Useful information as always. And thanks, everybody, for watching or listening.
Thanks everybody for joining today.